Judge Anne Dranginis is a true trailblazer. She was the first female assistant state's attorney in the history of the state of Connecticut. She was a Superior Court judge, an appellate court judge. She's now one of the most sought-after mediators in the state of Connecticut, including by me and by Rosemary. Please welcome to Justice Southbury, Judge Anne Dranginis.
Thanks so much, Rick. That last speech was terrific, and I'm like in awe of the stories that we can tell about women and their achievements. And it's interesting, Rick, that you talked about Love Your Neighbor. The Community Partners in Action, which is the old Connecticut Prison Association, a group that cares for people that are in some way involved in the criminal justice system, have a prison arts project. And an inmate did a beautiful shadow-boxed Love Your Neighbor with all sorts of animals, and there's a band, that's all on one piece of paper and done with a nail clipper in his prison cell, which I bought at the arts auction for Community Partners in Action. And so the whole concept of Love Your Neighbor is so important. It's so fundamental to really our constitutional scheme that it's something that we should talk about more often. And to have you talk about it as you began your remarks today really made me feel good about everything that's going on, and consistent with the sun being out today after the awful day that we had yesterday. But I really think that your group has given me some hope, because I'd like to congratulate you all for your significant perseverance, your persistence, perseverance, in gathering every Sunday and celebrating this 200th anniversary of your formation. This is a time in our country's history where we need to be on the streets. We need to be actively involved in talking to our neighbors, regardless of their political persuasion, about how important social justice is, how critical our democracy is, and how much work we have to do. For me, it's important that it's Women's History Month because it gives me an opportunity to be asked to, in my dotage, to talk about, my life as a trailblazer, as other people call it. Like so many aspects of our society, it certainly took a long time to recognize the important contributions of women to the development of this country, and the harm that has been occasioned by the siloing of women to the domestic arena. After all, Women's History Week only began in 1978 and became almost a national observance in 1980 when it was recognized by President Carter, and only became a month in 1987. So this year, the theme that has been talked about mostly is diversity, equality, and inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion, which of course we know in several states is being banned to be taught, that there are active interests to even dispel the notion that we should talk about such a thing in our social discourse and our political discourse. That attack really speaks legion to people who do not practice Love Your Neighbor. As a part of this month-long focus, I was asked to participate in a panel at the Office of the Chief State's Attorney last week. And it was interesting for me because Mary Galvin, who was the first woman state's attorney in the state's history, and I were asked to be on this panel. And when she and I were young prosecutors, and as I was a state's attorney before the court merger, we were really quite alone in a very male-dominated world, but we wanted to be trial lawyers and we loved criminal law, and it was something that she and I shared completely. And as we told our war stories to the assembled group of women assistant state's attorneys and deputy assistant state's attorneys, and there must have been at least, I'd say, 40 or 50 women in the room, and there were more who were attending on Zoom. It was a surprise to me that there were so many, because I haven't been really practicing in the criminal arena for a long time. But it was great to see them. And as we told our stories about what life was like in the late 70s, prosecuting criminal cases and dealing with some resistance to our presence, it was not so different than the stories that they were telling us in response to our questions to them. But you know, Connecticut has a very long history. The office of the state's attorney was founded in 1702 in Connecticut. They were essentially the king's attorneys, but it was really the first organized group of prosecutors in the colonial era. And it wasn't until my appointment in September of 1977 that a woman had been allowed to assume such a role. It was partly due to the fact that women weren't allowed to be lawyers until probably 100 years before that. And we all know how long it has taken the country to accept women as equal in voting rights. So women, I find it hard to believe that any woman would stand against voting rights, that would argue for voter suppression or any such thing, in light of the way women have been discriminated against in that important process. And of course, it took 72 years for a right to vote to be ratified to the United States Constitution. Seneca Falls happened in 1848, and the constitutional amendment was not ratified until 1920. So again, perseverance, persistence. So we really, I'm not entirely sure why we aren't a little bit more angry about it, because the stories, you know, if they don't get any better, you know, really something has to happen. And I think, frankly, things have gotten so much worse. But in 1980, Jimmy Carter signed the Proclamation for Women's History Week. And what he said I thought was really important enough to repeat, because it's quite a universal message. From the first settlers who came to our shores, from the first American Indian families who befriended them, men and women have worked together to build this nation. Too often, the women were unsung, and sometimes their contributions went unnoticed. But the achievements, leadership, courage, strength, and love of the women who built America was as vital as that of the men whose names we know so well. As Dr. Gerda Lerner has noted, women's history is women's right. It is an essential and indispensable heritage from which we can draw pride, comfort, courage, and long-range vision. I ask my fellow Americans to recognize this heritage with appropriate activities during National Women's History Week, March 2nd through 8, 1980. I urge libraries, schools, and community organizations to focus their observances on the leaders who struggled for equality. Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, Lucy Stone, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Harriet Tubman, and Alice Paul. Understanding the true history of our country will help us to comprehend the need for full equality under the law for all people. This goal can be achieved by ratifying the 27th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which states that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Well, we all know that the Equal Rights Amendment failed. And we all know that the goal of equality for women under the law has not been achieved. We still do not have an Equal Rights Amendment. Women are still not mentioned in the United States Constitution. And we have gone back 50 years or more in the right to control our own health care decisions. Peter Thiel, a very right-wing political operative and very wealthy man, has suggested out loud that women should not have the right to vote. It's staggering. It is inconceivable to most of us that anyone would even think that, let alone say it out loud. So it is important to be very vigilant to any erosion of justice to anyone, anytime. It is important to stand for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've received a lot of awards in my career, but my most treasured is the Connecticut Bar Association's Women in the Law Section Ladder Award. I was its first recipient. It recognizes one who has left the ladder down for others. A mentoring award, really, for one who supports the dreams of another. They were women in my case, because I recognized how long we had been kept in our place. When you believe that a woman's place is in Congress, the Senate, and the White House, and you work to see that happen, great things can happen. You know, America will be great, and is great, when it works toward its goal that all men, as in mankind, are created equal. This is not a new aspiration. It was the aspiration of peoples illegally brought to our shores, of peoples illegally deprived of their lands, of immigrants who came from Europe for a better life, of other citizens who are demanding their rights. It's together, having respect for everyone's capacity to bring value to this world, that we will make truly a more perfect union. Thank you all for being here, and keep your voice.